Well, I think the government's taking a very pragmatic approach in terms of ramping up their effects. I think, though, that we are really, a week ago, this is where Spain was, and they've gone to 5,000 cases in 7 days. We're about 18 days behind Italy in terms of, they had this many cases, 450 cases 18 days ago, and now they're at 31,000. So as a commentator, I guess I'm not the one paid to make the decisions, but go hard and go early. I guess the government are being pragmatic about it, and they have other things in their arsenal to consider around closures of schools and things. But I personally think that we probably need to go at this as just a little bit harder than we are now, because we're in a really interesting and a deadly phase, I think, of this virus. The doubling time has now gone from 5 days to 4 days, and is at nearly 3 days in our cases. And so this thing's really ramping up. And we also know that we basically have a 7-day window. What we do today will be reflected in the numbers in 7 days' time, and in 7 days' time we'll be right up there at about 4,000.
So when we have questions raised about testing, I know people that have felt like they had the symptoms but they haven't had direct contact, known contact with someone with COVID-19. They've been told that they're not in the category in which they should be tested. Do you have concerns about the criteria for when people get tested and when they don't?
There's a practicality around it. I mean, if we look at places like Singapore, they tested often and everyone, and they tested way more people per head of population than we have. It's disappointing to know that there's a shortage, apparently, of test kits, and we're trying to resolve that situation. And we certainly seem to be able to throw many billions of dollars at the economy. I would hope that there isn't really a resource issue in terms of being able to spend money on testing, because ultimately this is the thing that allows you to trace things. And if we don't know people have cases, and we've seen several examples of people who were refused testing and then later tested and found to be positive, then we really don't know how many cases we have, and we can't make our responses appropriate. So testing's really critical. I realise the government and all the state fed and governments are trying to do their best in terms of testing. I think that's a practical approach to the cases, but I would personally like to see more testing.
Do you accept, though, that there is a limitation to the number of tests that we can possibly perform? There are only so many test kits that we're ever going to have access to.
That's my understanding, and that's what I understand the Chief Medical Officer has indicated. There's a number of 400,000 new kits coming in from the US for testing. But clearly, I mean, this is a test that honestly any of my PhD or master's students could design. The sequences are all out there. We need to make sure we use our internal resources as well, and I'm pleased to see that the government has asked the Peter Doherty Institute to start developing tests that we can use internally. So I think that this is really an important area, because if we don't know what we're dealing with in a really accurate way, any response we make may be underwhelming because we just don't know the case. So testing's really important. All the countries that have responded really well, like Korea, Hong Kong and Singapore, do lots and lots of testing. And I guess the other thing they do is they communicate with the public really well, and I'd like to see this part of the government's response really be ramped up in terms of letting people know where the cases are, how many we have, who's getting it. We shouldn't be hiding any of this. I think the public can handle this information, the government have this information, and they should be sharing it on their websites.
Absolutely, and it's interesting you raised the Singapore example there, because that's what the Prime Minister referred to as well when he said that we didn't need to be locking down schools. Other first world economies have been keeping going, and that's the right medical advice. But I understand that in Singapore you do have much stricter screening, that at shopping centres there are people checking people's temperatures as they go in. Do we need more screening like that in public places?
Singapore, it's an unfair example in some ways, or comparison to make to Australia. I mean, they report their temperatures twice a day. They are followed by their phones in terms of if they're in isolation and go out, they're sent messages. They're sent messages by the government twice a day. So they have a much more strict regime, and they test way more than we have, as I said, per head of population. And they're a shining example of how to respond to this in some ways. So I think the fact that Singapore hasn't closed schools, they haven't needed to, because they've done such a job of tracing and isolating in a very relentless way, and now our authorities are doing that as well as possible. But of course, if we don't know people have got the infection, then we can't trace and isolate because we have no idea they've got it. As I say, I think we're doing really well, but I'm just starting to feel that we might just start to be slipping a little bit behind the curve here, and we need to be really responsive in terms of what we do.
So for viewers at home who don't have any symptoms, who aren't, they haven't been exposed to anyone with coronavirus, but they want to do their bit, what should people be doing?
Well, I know a number of companies, and my own university has asked people if there's no reason to be at work, you can work from home, and if you're lucky enough to be able to work from home, then I think that's a really viable option. For my own elderly parents, I've told them not to be going out at this time, particularly those who are vulnerable, have pre-existing conditions. I think you should now be staying at home, and I do their shopping for them if they need anything, and my wife. So I think this is the sort of thing we need to look out for each other. This is, as the Prime Minister said, a 1 in 100-year event. This is unprecedented. We'll look back on this year as something particularly memorable, I guess, in the wrong sort of way, as we look back on 2020. It's quite unprecedented. So if you can stay at home, stay at home. Obviously, you're not going to go out to gatherings now, less than 100. And so these are the sorts of things. And we're going to ramp our response up. There's no doubt, I think, that schools will close eventually. My interpretation is the government want to hold off till Easter, just as my own personal opinion, and then it might be easier. But by Easter, we'll be at 10,000 cases.